Good evening, Ray of Hope family. My name is Dr. Joel B. Kemp, and it's an honor to be with you. And what's hard to believe, this is our fourth session of our series on the Bible, Blackness, and Race in America. I hope and pray that you have enjoyed our conversation as much as I have. I'm looking forward to culminating it for tonight. Hopefully, this will not be our last time together forever, but at least our last time during this 4-week series. As always, I begin by thanking Pastor Hale and the Ray of Hope family and friends for joining us and making me feel so welcome and being so engaged in the conversation. As always, I do want this to be as conversational as possible. So whether you're on Facebook or on YouTube or any other the Ray of Hope's platforms, please send a little note in the chat with any questions, any reactions, any consternations. And you occasionally see me peeking to my left as I try to monitor the chat to see how the conversation is going there. As always, we want to try to incorporate that into our conversation throughout our time together. So again, good evening to everyone. Excited to be with you, and I agree it's excited for tonight, but hate that it ends. But hopefully this is just a long pause before we continue the conversation. So as you see on the screen, as is kind of our tradition, I begin with a quick review of a couple of the highlights from our last discussion, on the Mark of Cain. Then today we'll focus on probably the most common text that's used and misused to describe kind of Black life in America and our kind of rightful place in air quotes within America's racial caste system, and that's the so-called curse of Ham. And then I want to end with unpacking kind of what I call the now what, or what you see on the screen, this kind of American Christian Reformation. And I'll unpack this more, but kind of a preview of coming attractions is that for me, so much of what we see in our political landscape, although it has clear economic roots, clear historical roots, clear social problems, there's also a theological undercurrent that is often ignored or undertreated. And I think in all of the Reformation movements we've had for Black human rights in this country, we have not had enough of a concentrated focus on kind of a Christian or an American Christian Reformation. And I think that's one of the opportunities that this particular moment presents to us. So I'll spend some time unpacking that. So without any further ado, last week we looked at the so-called Mark of Cain. And again, that was the infamous story where Cain kills his brother Abel. And I talked about Cain becomes the first kind of villain in biblical traditions. And we see that not as much in Genesis 4, but certainly in later receptions of that, particularly 1 John 3. And we talked about how Cain and his descendants are associated with being the seed of the devil or being of the devil, while Abel's deemed kind of the righteous one and the martyr who's of God and of light. Within the context of this villainy of Cain, I talked about kind of the phrase that I often use called the 3 Ds of blackness. This notion that blackness is dangerous, deviant, and depraved. And that those 3 ideas, as false as they are and as unholy as they are, were rooted in particular kinds of racialized interpretations of the text of the Mark of Cain. And we will see in a few moments how some of those same ideas that we first encounter in the Mark of Cain gets applied and shifted to the curse of Ham. The second thing that we talked about in kind of the reception history of this text and its racialization was that Cain's mark, which in the biblical text is clearly meant as protection, gets shifted to become a form of punishment. So again, this shifting of the biblical mark of protection to a human sign of punishment becomes one of the defining characteristics of how this mark gets misappropriated and racialized in American context. So rather than, again, as the text itself tells us, when Cain petitioned God and said, casting me out will be too much for me, and if anyone who finds me, they'll kill me. And God says, well, I'll put this mark on you to let everyone know that you're off limits. That is, again, not how that mark gets misinterpreted and applied in American contexts. The third and final piece that we talked about was this idea that the Mark of Cain and this switch from protection to punishment allows folks to make certain essential claims about Blackness. That is, the three Ds are not just descriptions of what some Black people do, but it is rather a description of who and what we are. So Blackness therefore emerges as a curse, as a clear signpost to the world that anyone who bears these marks are not to be trusted, are not to be incorporated into the fellowship of the saints, that these are, persona non gratas, the ones who we have nothing to do with. And here I mentioned something that I brought up in our very first meeting together, which is the importance, as the picture on the screen has it, of having to whitewash the Bible. Because the only way that Blackness stands out as a curse presumes that you're in a biblical world where the dominant race of the people is white. Right? So if Cain was allegedly cursed with blackness in a Black continent, then that would mean nothing, because how would that stand out? But again, the whitewashing, the stripping of the African and Asian roots of these texts to allow them to be sort of the Nordic Jesus we saw in our first class, has implications for these kinds of claims about Blackness. So that Blackness is enabled to become the sign of a curse if the normative stance, the foundational approach, is that the Bible is a white person's story to which Black folk are invited as occasional guests. So as I mentioned, I think one of the goals of this next kind of wave in scholars and certainly the work that I'm doing, that we are doing together, is to stop asking the question, where is the Black presence in the Bible? But to assume that the Bible is a Black document, is, as some scholars call it, an Africana artifact. And that changes kind of our normative gaze of this text, and then our diagnosis of how it's been misused. So that's sort of a 4-minute summary of where we were last week. The last thing I want to say as transition into today's conversation is, if the mark of Cain is used to describe who and what we are, then there becomes a question, well, in light of who and what Black folk are, where do they fit within the American structure? And to answer that question, America has historically turned to the so-called curse of Ham. I put the so-called curse of Ham in parentheses, or excuse me, quotation marks, to underscore the most important point. At no point in the biblical tradition is Ham cursed. At no point in the biblical tradition is Ham ever cursed. Ham is in fact only blessed. One of the reasons that becomes important, and as someone who studies reception history in my sort of academic pursuits, this text is a great example of the power of reception history. If you ask the average person who attends church, was Ham cursed? Most would say, well, yeah. And you ask them, well, why do you know that? Well, because that's what I've heard all of my life. And with very rare exceptions, do people actually believe Ham was not cursed until you have them walk through the text verse by verse to see that that does not occur. For the sake of time, we will not read each verse, but I do want to highlight a couple of threads. The first one, I saw Miss Allen put it, the Ham is blessed as a topic, absolutely. And that's how this text begins, right? That it picks up at the end of the flood narrative, and it describes that Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Nothing is said about their race. Nothing is said about their characters at this early moment. After Noah briefly introduces the father of these 3 sons, we are told, and in verse 19, that from all of these 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the entire world is populated. So at least from the biblical anthropological perspective, all of us are kinfolk. That is, we all trace our ancestry back to the survivors of the flood. The Bible then goes on to describe, starting in verse 20, that Noah plants a vineyard and gets drunk from the product of that vineyard. A lot of interesting ink has been spilled onto why that's important. For our purposes, it's simply a sign of a certain amount of stability and relative prosperity after the flood. If you have the time to grow vineyards to produce wine, then you're not struggling just to survive. So in this context, we get the story of Noah getting drunk, passing out in his dwelling place, most likely a tent of some sort. Ham finds his father naked, runs out and tells his brothers, Shem and Japheth, that our father is drunk and naked. Shem and Japheth, in one of the more awkward scenes in the Bible, places a cloth or a robe over their shoulders, and they back into the tent to cover their father's nakedness without ever having seen it. When Noah wakes up in the morning, presumably now sober, he becomes aware of what Ham has done and pronounces a curse on Canaan. And again, I want to say that again. When Noah wakes up and is presumably sober, he pronounces a curse on Canaan, never on Ham. Now, there are a lot of questions about this text. One of them is, what is Ham's crime? Part of what Ham's crime is leads to, as you see on the screen, this question of slavery's justification. So when Noah curses Canaan, and again, not Ham, but when he curses Canaan, he says that Canaan will forever will be a servant of servants to his brothers Japheth and to his brother Shem. So that phrase, a servant of servants or a slave of slaves, becomes this idea that everyone who is a descendant of Canaan should forever be a slave of Ham, of Japheth and Shem. Now, again, the curse is on Canaan, not on Ham. If you read in Genesis 10, Ham has a handful of sons and dozens of grandchildren, which do populate the fullness of the continents of Africa and parts of Asia. Canaan, interestingly, only gets one sliver of land, which is now modern-day Israel, Palestine, and ancient Philistia, or parts of Philistia. Part of why that becomes important is for many scholars, and I am among that group, the curse on Canaan seems to have direct implications for the eventual conquest of what is called the Promised Land. So if you fast forward several books in the biblical tradition, the Israelites or the Hebrews will come to occupy the land of the Canaanites. What many scholars argue is that this description of the curse on Canaan and Canaan being a servant of servants or a slave of slaves to Shem and to Japheth is a way of explaining how it is that the Israelites can claim Canaan's land as their own and can then take the descendants of Canaan and make them work for the Israelites when they take over that land. So it's a very specific, limited kind of curse. And again, I saw in the chat, right, that the curse was on Canaan, not on Ham. This notion of slavery being a part of Noah's curse, again, having been with me now for 3 weeks, you quickly understand how this then becomes a central argument for where Black people belong. What is interesting about this, and we'll unpack a bit later, is this argument that all of Ham's descendants are to be enslaved later gets expanded to describe that all non-Japheth folk, or all non-Semites, or put another way, all descendants of Ham, have to be at the lowest rung of society. And we'll unpack that in a few moments. So, slavery's justification, Ham's crime. If you read the text carefully, it's hard to figure out what exactly Ham did. So certainly you can argue, if you see a parent drunk, you may not want to go tell your whole family about it, but is that really a sin that deserves a curse? As one might imagine, where the Bible is silent, human imaginations, particularly racialized imaginations, run wild. For the sake of the fact that there may be children listening or watching, I won't give all the gory details about some of the different interpretations that arise from Ham's alleged crime. But let's just say that many of them revolve around sex and sexual violence. That is allegedly Ham's crime. Again, the biblical text does not say that, but there are a series of interpretive traditions that try to make the argument that the severity of the curse on Canaan reflects some kind of serious perversion of Ham. And in some cases, the argument is that Canaan is the byproduct of one of the crimes that took place. So therefore, the curse that Noah puts on Canaan is a result of that. Again, not in the Bible, but in the reception history. That is the stories of how people have interpreted this passage. That's one of the things that comes about with Ham's crime. And so Ham's crime gets expanded to so-called justify the curse, again, not upon him, but upon Canaan. And you can see in some of these ideas of how some of the 3Ds of dangerousness, and particularly of depravity, begins to take hold in Ham's story. Now, if that is somehow Ham's story, and the curse, again, on Canaan, but somehow gets conflated with Ham, we still have to answer the question, how does Ham become black? The answer to that question is in part the text that we began with. And I zoomed in on the screen so you can see kind of a standard rendition of the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. What should be clear, according to this kind of version of the Table of Nations and this artist's depiction of it, is that Ham gets associated with Black Africa. So as a part of that association with Black Africa, as we talked about before, if blackness carries all of these negative connotations, then Ham's descendants, and the land out of which he emerged becomes a focal point of dumping all of these negative attributes onto Black folk in general. Japheth, as you see on the left, is the fairest skin of the individuals and is often classified as being the father of all white individuals. And from the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, he does get lands that we would define today as being part of the continent of Europe and some parts of Asia. As recently as early part of this century, you will hear rhetoric of prominent pastors in conservative circles appealing to this model and declaring that America is a descendant of Japheth. And so we as white Americans are heirs to this noble tradition. One of the interesting perversions of the name Japheth in Hebrew, Yafet, is that it's associated in times with words of beauty or attractiveness. So you will find often in American interpretations, particularly in the 19th century and building into the 21st century, that they will argue that Japheth, meaning beautiful, must mean white. Because after all, what is more beautiful than whiteness? And you'll see this particularly during kind of the lost cause mythology of the 19th century, in the attempts of the Confederacy to rebuild its image of itself and therefore how it projects itself within American contexts. Shem, on the far right, appears as kind of a somewhere in between Ham and Japheth's skin tone. So often Shem gets associated with so-called Middle Eastern or more broadly Arab populations. Again, these are all later readings of the Genesis 10 text, but that's how these texts get racialized in part. So one is that's geography and the lands that they ultimately inhabit and the dominant racial characteristics of those individuals. So that's one way that Ham becomes black. The second way Ham becomes black in this history of interpretation relates to the mark of Cain. And here, you have to suspend disbelief for one moment and pretend that we know things that the Bible never tells us. So, There are two ways that Canaan and or Ham can become black on a biological level. One is they get it through a father, one they get it through a mother. In this conflation of Canaan with Ham and the blackness and the curse being upon both of them, there becomes this rampant strand of thought that says the mark of Cain, which was blackness, gets transferred to Ham after the flood. Why was that reading necessary? Well, if you go back to Genesis 4, where the mark of Cain is given, Genesis 5 is a long genealogy that most people who aren't biblical scholars skip, and wisely so. You know, biblical scholars, we get excited about strange things, and genealogies are one of them. Then we pick up in Genesis 6, and it's the story of the flood. According to the biblical account, only 8 human beings survive: Noah and his wife, Shem and his wife, Ham and his wife, and Japheth and his wife. Cain's descendants that are listed at the end of Genesis 4 and partially of Genesis 5 presumably all died in the flood. So the question becomes, if they all died in the flood, how could they possibly still be around now? That objection was raised by one of my favorite sort of heroes or heroines of the 19th century, Sojourner Truth. When she confronted this kind of mark of Cain heresy, she would say, well, if that's true, according to your own Bible, all of Cain's descendants had to die. So how did the mark persist? Tragically, where there is a live white supremacist will, there is often a perverse biblical way. The way they got there was to say, well, who did Ham marry? And again, the biblical text does not support this. But many argue that Ham's wife was one of the daughters of Cain, who was also then marked with blackness. So therefore, if Ham marries a daughter of Cain, and Cain, who's cursed with blackness, she gives birth to a child, one of those children would likely be black as well. Which child was black? The argument becomes Canaan. And again, the conflation of the names Cain and Canaan contributes, at least in English. In Hebrew, they're drastically different. But at least in English, the connection between Cain and Canaan allows for this kind of sloppy racialized interpretation that gets Ham to be black on another level. So one argument is that Ham is black because of his geography. Another is Ham is black through a conflation of the mark of Cain and Cain's descendants. I saw in the chat, it's like Ms. Williams said, how do they justify this when geographically the climate creates dark hues and skin tone based on where they were? Yes, absolutely. Good question. So there are two ways that this gets justified. The first is to recognize that throughout the 18th and 19th century, particularly in the 19th century, much of the scientific community did not assert, as you did, and rightly so, as most of us understand in the 21st century, that skin color is a response to environmental factors. Throughout both science and theology in the 19th century, along with philosophy and other disciplines, the argument was that skin color reflected fundamental differences in the nature of human beings, if they could all be called human beings. Because in the 19th century, the vast majority of scientists and really all forms of education were still shaped profoundly by religious ideas, then even the variances among species were understood to be a part of the divine creative act, creative acts, plural. So part of how it gets justified is that the skin tone and the climate alone is insufficient. You will read, Thomas Jefferson does this, and in other places, how the argument becomes the hot climate of Africa is itself a divine marker to speak to the hotness of Africans. And that hotness gets articulated in perceptions of sexual deviance and in violence. And so you will see that kind of language throughout. Yeah, so you put in the chat, wow, yeah, absolutely. When you first start encountering kind of this web of nonsense, it's amazing how much they work to keep it coherent. And for me, what's particularly important is as hard as they work to make it coherent, it has now become so much a part of the American psyche, and where, frankly, wherever the American empire has reached, that we operate on these things, even if we know it's bad Bible and bad science. But in some ways, the harm has already been done, and we have to kind of unlearn it and unpack it in new ways. Absolutely. So, again, Table of Nations, geography, Mark of Cain, potential speculation. Then the third is the imagined consequences of Ham's sin. So again, depending upon how one understands what Ham did wrong, and then assuming that all that then gets connected to Canaan, and we ignore the fact that the Bible curses Canaan and never Ham, how do we end up getting Ham as blackness? Well, one tradition we've already explored, which is from the Mark of Cain, right? That in a normative white world, blackness from Cain's point forward is always associated with sin and judgment. So the fact that Ham sinned meant he became black. So that blackness and sin become synonymous. And we talked about it last week, how in rabbinic and early Christian interpretations, blackness was a metaphor, darkness was a metaphor for evil. But those metaphors become phenotypical characteristics or skin color within Europe, and then certainly in Europe's progeny here in America. The second thing that happens is some of the sin that Ham is said to have committed in the Hebrew Bible becomes the basis for certain kinds of physical characteristics. And if you want to read these, I can give you the sources, but I just chose not to list them so as not to burden you with, as Mr. Brown put in the chat, bad Bible and bad science. But there's a whole lot of bad Bible and bad science you can find on these topics. One of the arguments becomes Ham, when he finds his father naked, goes out and tells his brothers. One tradition suggests that because Ham's sin was with his lips, God inflated his lips and made them thick, so the world would know he was a gossiper, and God hates gossip. Which again is a way of describing non-white phenotypical characteristics. They would also argue that because Ham was twisted in his behavior, particularly if one argues that it was in some ways sexual, then the twistedness of his behavior matches the twistedness of his hair. So again, so that God literally crowned Black folk with signs of our twistedness, so that our hair texture is now a sign of divine cursing. Again, all demonic nonsense. And because we're on a sacred platform, I will not use stronger language that the Bible uses, but you can fill it in on your own time. One of the things that happens, and where people talk about kind of internalized racism or kind of absorbing kind of this live white supremacy, is that how often do we in Black communities talk about good hair versus bad hair? And how often do we spend countless hours trying to get rid of certain parts of our hair because we have inherited a belief that our hair is somehow bad? Well, part of the stream that feeds to that notion of good hair versus bad hair, I want to say it was a Chris Rock who did a whole kind of documentary on hair back, 25 years ago, 30 years ago now, where he explored some of this. One of the underappreciated streams that contributes to that nonsense are these kinds of racialized interpretations. I saw in the chat, Ms. Latimer wrote, wow, absolutely. And see Miss Branch put racism, absolutely. It literally colors so much of how we interact with the world, and including how we view ourselves as colored folk, as Angela Simmons put in the chat about colored people, right? That we view ourselves through these prisms. And part of the challenge, both communally and individually, is how do we recognize, again, the theological streams that contribute to so much of the battles we confront on a daily basis. So again, Ham becomes Black through an understanding of geography of the Table of Nations, an understanding of heredity passed through the Mark of Cain speculation, then finally imagined consequences of Ham's sin. So that kind of lays a biblical framework for this. I saw in the chat, Ms. Williams asked the question, so does anyone ever pair Caucasians with those who had leprosy with whiteness because the skin turned white? Yes, absolutely. We mentioned this briefly in, I think, our first one, but it's worth unpacking more now that we've kind of traveled a bit on this journey. So in 2 Kings, there's a famous passage about the prophet Elisha and his servant Gehazi. You may recall Elisha heals a Syrian general or Syrian commander named Naaman of leprosy. When Naaman is healed, Elisha tells Naaman and Gehazi, a servant, I don't want any money, I don't want anything from this, just go back home and be whole. Gehazi, on his own, decides, I think my master ought to get paid from the Syrian army. This man came with all these riches. It makes no sense for him to do this work and Elisha leave empty-handed. So Gehazi chases after Naaman, says, hey, my master changed his mind. Break me off a little bit of what you have. I can take it back to my master and we can all live happily ever after. As Gehazi returns back to Elisha, Elisha meets him and says, didn't you know that my spirit went with you? And I know that you lied on me and on God. Loose paraphrase. So then Elisha says, therefore the leprosy that was on Naaman will cling to you, Gehazi, and all of your descendants forever. And then depending on what English translation you have, then says, and Gehazi left from Elisha's presence, leprous and as white as snow. So in many Black religious traditions, that story becomes an origin story for whiteness. And it does something that all of this work that we've been tracing that's been done to Blackness, the biblical text actually does most of that for you. Again, I'm not endorsing this as right or holy or good, but it is important to understand that if we're going to use this racialized method of interpreting scripture, one has a better argument for whiteness as a curse than you do for Blackness as a curse. Because in the Gehazi story, Gehazi did actually lie. He did actually steal. And the disease that was, and the curse that was pronounced upon him was a disease that's often associated with white skin, which again reminds us that we're dealing with a biblical text where the people in it were Black and brown skin. So there's a wonderful article, or several wonderful articles, but the one that immediately comes to mind is by a sister, Dr. Junior, called, was it the Mark of Cain as White Violence? The Mark of Cain as White Violence, where she walks through this tradition, Ms. Williams, and gives you kind of a good bibliography about where you can find some of this work being done. And certainly, I think in our second session, we talked a bit about the Nation of Islam, the Hebrew Israelites, and some of their rhetoric around the chosenness of Blackness and therefore the curse, or at least the need to reject whiteness, grows out of some interpretations of whiteness that comes from that Gehazi story. So yes, absolutely, that is another current that I explore in some of my work and others have done as well. So I hope that kind of answered your question, Ms. Williams, but if there are other follow-up that you have or others, please feel free to drop it in the chat and we'll try to answer them in our last 20 or so minutes together. So from this foundation, How does that relate to us today? The most important way that it relates is how, again, under this live white supremacy and the ways in which racial caste gets structured, the so-called curse of Ham gets used and invoked to argue that Black folk belong at the bottom of society and always separate from white people. So again, within American context, this curse, so-called curse of Ham, gets used to say that Black folk belong on the lowest rung of the social ladder, the lowest caste, and we should always be separated from white folk. If you go back to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, and there's a wonderful documentary that talks about this within the context of the Little Rock Nine, you will hear pastors arguing the reason that integration is a sin is that it violates the curse of Ham by causing the races to mix. Now, again, the curse of Ham says nothing about Ham being cursed, says nothing about race, says nothing about separation. But after 200 plus years of playing that story, of playing that record, playing that song of the curse of Ham, by the time it's received in the 1950s and 1960s, it is a text that stands as God's endorsement of segregation. And in fact, becomes a point to argue that if you seek integration, you actually are going against the divine will. I saw in the chat, Brown put the chat, The Mark of Cain and White Violence. Yes, that's the article by Nyasha Jr. I was referencing. Thank you for putting that there for everyone. So this notion that our rightful place is there allows for a certain kind of theory of social construction to take root. And for me, we see and hear this within this context now. I saw in the chat from Ms. Hogues, did low literacy rates in Europe contribute to the proliferation of these teachings? Absolutely, both within Europe and in early America. It's literacy rates depending on who you're studying, on what kind of sociologist and historian you read. Literacy rates rarely got above the 10 to 20% across continents, which meant the majority of the people's access to the biblical text was through what their pastors preached, was through what their lawyers, their deacons, their doctors, the experts taught them. So one of the ways in which these kinds of teachings gained such a foothold was that if only 1 in, say, 5 people could read, and the 1 in 5 people who read, half of them were trained in seminaries and in law schools and in anthropology departments that taught these kinds of lies, then the likelihood of breaking through that with another counter narrative or another interpretation of the biblical text was very low. Again, even in modern context, one of my colleagues, Dean Teresa Fry Brown, has talked about that if you are literate, you are among a privileged class in the world. I believe in the world it's less than 1/3, and around 1/3 of the people on the planet are literate. So even today, if you're able to read, you're among a small group. And so to the extent illiteracy is a factor in these kinds of bad theology producing bad politics, we're still in a world where 2 out of every 3 people, roughly, would still be dependent upon others telling them what the text said, rather than being able to read it for themselves. So that's absolutely part of the factor to your question, Ms. Hogues. So the second piece of kind of its relevance for today is this piece that you see on the screen now of Black advancement versus divine order. If Black folk are descendants of Ham, and we are cursed to be the slave of slaves, then what do you do when you have a black man as president, a black woman as vice president, a black man as a professor who married a black woman who's also a professor. All of these things suggest that black folk can advance. But if God has ordained for us to be at the bottom rung of society, then our advancement is an actual violation of God's order. This ungodly logic, in my opinion, is baked into a lot of the hysteria and the violent backlash we are seeing now within the context of various kind of rollbacks of so-called DEI, so-called affirmative action. At the core of these rollbacks, from my perspective, is these negative views of blackness and white and overinflated views of whiteness, such that America belongs to whites and whites only. And any intrusion upon that is, again, not just a threat to the American order, but is a threat to the divine order, which allegedly America represents, which is part of what we talked about in our second episode, or second time together. I saw a couple of things pop into the chat, so let me take a moment to look at some of those. Starting with, looks like Mr. Connor wrote, "The control of information and lack of education leads to the control of the masses." Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the goals of the work that we were doing together in our sessions, and the larger work of which this is a part, and how this is part of the work that my wife and I do in churches and communities, is to try to bring this information so that we recognize how so much of what we know is controlled. And sort of the faucet to theology is often controlled by individuals who are steeped in this lie of white supremacy. And so how do we then recognize that and then counter that, both within our own individual context and within our community context? So, in some of the conversations I'm having in higher education right now about the various assaults in higher ed and rolling back all things related to, minority-based scholarships, gender-based scholarships, as an alleged form of discrimination against white individuals, right? That, first of all, that runs counter to the facts that for centuries, this country only gave opportunities to white individuals, and only specifically to white males. But if you don't know that history, then one can make the case, again, if you believe some of these stories, or even if you don't believe them, you've imbibed them, then any form of Black success is itself a violation or a robbing of white place. And so that's part of, again, why that control of the masses is so possible if education and information is not there. But again, that's why it's not surprising that in this current administration, an ideological form of education is all that's being permitted, or at least that's what they're trying to do. The second comment that I saw came from, it's like Ms. Gunter. So in Genesis 9:18, it lists the sons of Noah. Besides Ham, in parentheses, it says the father of Canaan. Then in Genesis 9:22, it says Ham, the father of Canaan. So all this was added to the text to enhance this idea of blackness, is the question. Yeah, excellent question. So what you picked up on is something that scholars talk a lot about. And this will be a technical term called redaction. Redaction comes from a German word that means to edit. One of the things that many scholars argue is that when we think about the Bible, many scholars argue that it's been a text that's been written over time. That is, we're reading a text that wasn't written at one historical moment, but was written over several historical moments. For scholars who believe that idea of redaction criticism and who kind of teach about it, what you pointed out in Genesis 9:18 and 9:22 is one of those moments where if you were to read the text in English and take out the language, the father of Canaan, the text kind of reads pretty smoothly. So, for example, Genesis 9:18 in the New Revised Standard, and I'll take out the father of Canaan. It simply says this: the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Verse 19, these three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled. So if I take out that Ham was the father of Canaan, the two verses run smoothly together, and you really don't even notice that something was missing. So anytime scholars see that kind of pattern, we often think about, was that redacted? Was that added in, to use your language, Ms. Gunter? The question of, was this added in to enhance the idea of blackness? The response to that question is no. The original biblical writers, to the extent it was edited and that phrase was put in, what most scholars would argue, and I would agree with this position, is that it was added to explain how ancient Israel conquered ancient Canaan. Right? So again, it's how ancient Israel, in, depending on who's telling the story, late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, how they conquered the land of Canaan. And so this connection between Ham and Canaan and why they get cursed becomes a way of explaining kind of theologically the military conquest that Israel would later have of Canaan. How this becomes connected to blackness is not with the original biblical writers, but with European and American interpreters several millennia later. So if the Genesis text reaches its final form around, we'll say, 500 BCE, the racialized interpretations that we were talking about appear really, 1700s? So we're talking over 2,000 years later. So it's that 2,000 years later, with all of the speculation and the development of racism or the lie of white supremacy, that then this text becomes central to that. So that's kind of how I would sort of track the development of that. So hopefully, Ms. Gunter, that was clear. If there's anything else, please definitely drop it in the chat, and I'll try to clarify anything that I may have went through too quickly. Then the last comment that I saw come in recently was from Mr. Brown, where he writes, amazing how people only justify what is wrong. Right does not need to be justified because right will justify itself. Yes, absolutely. That often, my parents would often say, lying is just much harder than telling the truth, because when you lie, you got to track too much stuff. And so part of the issue with this lie of white supremacy and justifying really the unjustifiable, which is to treat one set of the human population as though they were barely better than animals, right? And in fact, Frederick Douglass, in one of his narratives, talks about that the animals on some of the plantations where he was enslaved got better treatment than black folk. So the only way to justify that and to soothe one's own conscience, as Dr. Mitzi Smith describes it, is to engage in these kind of biblical gymnastics, to create and, again, defend the indefensible, in my opinion. You're welcome, Ms. Gunter. I saw your thank you. Saw in the chat from Mr. Brown, I believe it's Mr. Brown, yes. In your experience, how have you observed the different generations within the Black faith traditions understand the relationship between institutional religion, divine order, and Black advancement? Yes, excellent question. So I think there are, two things that I'll say about that. A third came to mind, but for sake of time, I may table that for a moment, but we'll see. It's important to draw that distinction that you did between institutional religion, and then I would add, and being a disciple of Jesus Christ. Going back to something we mentioned in one of our earlier conversations, Ms. Brown, I think it is, comment that in the context of Frederick Douglass, who talked about the Christianity of America, he views as being an anathema, a perversion of the true Christianity of Christ. And that the Christianity of Christ, Douglass has no objection to, but the Christianity of America doesn't even deserve to go by the name of Christianity. So I think that institutional religion, I would connect to that piece that Frederick Douglass described early on, Mrs. Brown, in terms of saying, hey, this is just wrong. And one of the challenges for particularly some of my conservative brothers and sisters, particularly my white conservative brothers and sisters, is that the distinction between that institutional religion or that American Christianity and the Christianity of Christ has been so blurred that to challenge one is ultimately to dismiss the other. And it's that conflation that this work and others, I think, is trying to address. If one can separate American Christianity from the Christianity of Christ, then the last 2 points, Mrs. Brown, of divine order and Black advancement, they kind of fall away because of this. They are sort of, to me, secondary consequences of that first principle. So if the biblical text says nothing about a racialized divine order, then any racialized orders cannot be divine, but must be demonic. Right? So again, if the Bible says nothing about a racialized divine order, then any racialized orders must be demonic. And that's the piece that when I talk about kind of the need for a reformation of American Christianity, that's the piece that has to, I think, gain more traction. So again, institutional religion, that Christianity of Christ versus the Christianity of America, recognizing that there is no such thing as a racialized divine order. Then when we get to Black advancement, we no longer have a problem. In fact, I would argue Black advancement is a necessary sign of America's repentance. Right? If you forgive me to jump to the New Testament for a few seconds, I believe it's in Matthew's gospel where John the Baptist is preaching, and various of the religious leaders come out to him and they repent. And John the Baptist celebrates that, but then says, now go produce fruit. That is, show that your repentance is real, right? So produce fruit. The King James says, produce fruit meet for repentance. That meet in King James, M-E-E-T, means appropriate, representative of repentance. One of my teachers, Dr. Cornell West, was fond of saying that no nation can love a people and do to us what America has done to Black folk. And so for me, and we talked about this a little bit in our second session, if America truly loved us, it could not do what it has done to us and is doing to us. And so Black advancement is not a threat, but it is a fulfillment of whatever God's promise might be for this country. And that to me is something that, again, I hope that the work we are doing here and as we spread this word to others will allow that to take place. So hopefully that answered your question a bit, Mrs. Brown. If, again, other things are there, please feel free to drop it back in the chat in our last couple of minutes together. In the chat, I can't quite see the name, but it says which version of the Bible is most accurate as it relates to the curse of Noah's offspring? If by accurate you mean which ones have the curse of Canaan versus the curse of Ham, to the best of my knowledge, all modern translations talk about the curse of Canaan. Where you would find some disagreement is some still will have a subheading. So, some Bibles are broken into sections. And some will still have like the curse of Ham as a section rather than the sons of Noah. But I believe most of those have now gone out of circulation. But generally speaking, the biblical text has always been clear. Certainly in the Hebrew, it's clear. And in the Septuagint, the Greek version of it, that it is Canaan who was cursed. So again, it's just the power of reception history, which suggests that Canaan was not cursed, but Ham was. So in some ways, it's not a question of biblical accuracy. It's a question of how we read it, which goes back to some of the earlier conversation we had about reading it for ourselves and not being solely reliant on others' kind of problematic racialized frameworks. So I hope that answered the question. And I saw in the chat Ms. Brandt saying, I agree. I thought that popped up in the context of response to Ms. Brown's question. Well, beloved, unbelievably, we are at the end of our fourth session. Again, it has been an honor to be with you during these last 4 weeks as we've explored the Bible, Blackness, and Race in America. And it is, again, my great pleasure to be with you, and my hope that we can continue the conversation at another time. It has definitely been, hopefully, eye-opening. I was encouraged and touched by a number of the comments that I saw and people saying it's helped us set us free. And that is indeed the goal of this work. And as Pastor Hale said in her closing to our first session, that one whom the Son sets free is free indeed. And I do hope that this time has been a part of that freeing. It's my understanding that we have Brother Donnell with us from Candler's Foundry, who has helped coordinate all of this and to bring us together in this time. So if that is accurate, there you see Donnell pop at the corner of my eye. I know you had a couple of things that you wanted to share with us before we officially part ways.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Kemp. I am so happy to be here. As Dr. Kemp said, my name is Donnell Williamson, and I serve as the Assistant Director of Community Learning and Partnerships at the Candler Foundry, which is an initiative at Candler School of Theology at Emory University, where Dr. Joel Kemp is a professor in Hebrew Bible, and he's such a gifted theologian who knows how to bridge the work of pastoral care in the life of the mind. And so I just want to say thank you, Dr. Kemp, for showing up and really offering a very unique perspective, one that is necessary in these times. And so thank you. I also want to say thank you to Dr. Cynthia Hale for all the amazing work that she's doing at Ray of Hope. Ray of Hope is such a beacon in the community, and it is because of such a fearless and spiritual leader like Dr. Hale, reasons why we're able to continue to do the work that we're doing at the Foundry, and so happy to partner with such a loving and caring ministry like Ray of Hope. And so I just wanted to share a few things about the Candler Foundry. The Candler Foundry was founded in 2020. One of the amazing things about it is that it was created to bridge the work of both the church and the academy. And so we bring courses to the community like the one that you participated in tonight, and in hopes that those lay persons and lay leaders can experience some thoughtful and generative insights, because we believe that churches are the theological generators of our communities. And so thought just does not live and belong to the academy. It is something that also should be done in community and in ministry. I want to share with you a graphic. This graphic is essentially an opportunity for us to stay in contact with you. I believe we're going to drop the link in the chat. And so if you want to learn more about what the Foundry does, if you want to stay connected and learn about some courses that we're offering that you can partake in, or some certificate programs because you want to dive deeper into theological education. Maybe you don't have 3 years to commit to seminary, but you want to do some deeper diving and deeper learning because Dr. Kemp has opened your mind to some new ideas and new concepts. So I would suggest you scanning this QR code or checking out that link so we can stay in contact. You will be connected directly with me, and I will be happy to follow up with you. Again, my name is Donnell Williamson, and if you want to email me, the quickest way to do that is dwilliamson@emory.edu. Again, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Hale. Thank you, Dr. Kemp. God bless you all.
Amen. Thank you. I just want to say thank you to all the kind words in the chat. It's definitely been a blessing. As I said, I'm hopeful we'll be back together again as our time allows. So a couple people raised a question in the chat about, am I doing lectures in other churches or things like that? Absolutely. I do that. And I can be in touch with Dr. Farmer and certainly Pastor Hale to let you know when those opportunities exist. And I'd love to have you to join those conversations. And I believe, and Donnell can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe there's a possibility of the full semester version of the course that I'm offering at the Foundry. I believe there's a way, I see you nodding on the corner of my eye, a way for some students to participate in that. But I'll pause there so you can provide what those details are so I don't mislead the Ray of Hope family.
Yes, we are still working out the details, but the best way to know fresh off the press when that takes place is to sign up for our newsletter, which will be using that link or scanning that QR code.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. And again, look forward to being back with you all again. But as we conclude this time, I know that the conversation, although it stops at this moment, does not stop permanently. If I remember correctly, you have opportunity to join in your small group discussions. And I see the graphic popped up. So if you're on, go onto the rayofhope.org website and join in small groups there to continue this conversation. And certainly as things come up from that, please make note of them. And when we are back together, we have an opportunity to spend some time unpacking that more as a Ray of Hope community and those outside of the Ray of Hope community who have joined us for this moment. And as always, the last slide is an invitation. I'll do my best, Pastor Hale, stand in to invite you to come back and join the Ray of Hope family on Sunday. And again, it starts at 10 a.m. You can see on the screen, you can join both in person and via various platforms, most likely the very platforms that you are viewing this program today. If I can take 10 seconds to close with a little Hebrew blessing. Often when I end these courses, I end with the conclusion from the book of Numbers, the so-called priestly blessing. And it ends with the phrase, "May the Lord grant you peace." Vayasim lecha shalom. Literally what that means is, may the Lord appoint for you not just peace, but wholeness. And as we study these texts and the ways they have been racialized, they have often been tools that have attempted to break us, to keep us literally bound in chains. But I believe the power of Christ and the truth of Scripture is indeed that which sets us free. And it is through that wholeness is appointed. So my hope and prayers that our time together has been a small step in that process. Vayasim lecha shalom. May the Lord appoint for you peace. God bless you, Ray of Hope family. It's been an honor and look forward to being with you soon.